All right, why don't we get started? Welcome to our monthly webinar on the Anthropocene to the Ecozoic. This is a webinar that is organized by two of our projects, Economics for the Anthropocene and Leadership for the Ecozoic. And today we're thrilled to have three PhD students from these two projects. This webinar has a common theme of Indigenous perspectives on everything from economics and development to law. And we're really, really pleased to have Iván Vargas, Alice DeManio, and Ben Collins with us today. So they're each going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then that'll give us time for 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A in between. And we'll be all wrapped up by 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. So first up is Iván Vargas. Iván, you want to go ahead and share your slides, and I'll do a quick introduction while you're putting your slides up. Iván is a PhD candidate in natural resource sciences at McGill University. He's also part of our Leadership for the Ecozoic Partnership. Iván is a lawyer by training with master's degrees from both the National University of Columbia and Duke University. And he's going to be talking to us today about learning law otherwise, Indigenous thought, earth law, and the more than human in Amazonia, Colombia. Iván, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, John. And I'm really happy and honored to be sharing this panel with Alice and with Ben, and just very happy to be part of this conversation as well. So I want to start by saying that our university is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst different nations for a long time. I recognize that this community are the traditional custodians of the lands and water, and now air via Zoom, on which we're meeting today. So this is an outline of what I want to speak about today with you. And I'm going to start with an introduction, an overview of work and the implications of my work, and just a couple of ideas for us to continue thinking forward about these themes. So I want to continue by sharing a story by the Inga indigenous community from the region of Nariño, where I do my work. Inga indigenous scholar and practitioner and political authority, Tai Hernando Chindoy, shared this story with me about a year ago. As we listen to it, I would like us to consider what normative, ethical-like cues we can learn from this story. And by this, I mean, in what way can we consider the story as a form of law? So it was the time when plants and animals transmitted their powers and knowledge to people while hunting and dreaming. One day, a hunter and healer was searching for the home of the tapir. Following a path through hundreds of frailejones, which is a kind of plant in the moors of Colombia, the hunter saw the mountain where the tapir lives. The hunter saw two different kinds of plants, one small and the other was large, the chichajas, a medicinal plant. He had to choose one of them and pick the small one. With this plant, he was able to see good spirits. He dreamt about these plants and learned what the small chichaja was protection against evil spirits and enemies. Also, he saw two ducks swimming. One was white and the other was yellow, and the hunter chose the first one. Having the chance to take the yellow duck as well, he decided instead to leave it there. The hunter met an elderly curaca, or medicine person, and told him, I had taken all the knowledges that had been offered to me in the mountains near the moor, but left one knowledge in the place where I saw the yellow duck. And the old curaca, or medicine person, replied, I am the owner of the tapir and of everything that you saw and heard. You did right to choose what you wanted, but you should have taken the yellow duck as well, he said, because it means gold. Now you will never see the yellow duck again. This is how the hunter and healer discovered the knowledge that was in the house of the tapir. Since then, the tapir is the augury of times of abundance. So why does the tapir story matter today? The story of the tapir raises, and many other stories, raises a challenging question in times of planetary crisis. In a world where animals, plants, and other beings have futures, human features, I hope, such as the ability to communicate and transmit knowledge to humans, words such as society and law seem to take on an entirely different meaning. The fact that for some communities, other than human beings can transmit their powers and personalities through ritual and dreams seems to tell us a different story of what makes us humans as well. How may stories of life, society, and law not centered around the modern human help us to navigate present times of socio-ecological collapse while bringing forth new possibilities? What would happen to normative systems when we leave room for the time when plants and animals transmitting their powers and knowledge to people in dreams? What if we imagine a form of law beyond human modes of representing the world and communicating? And how would this transform the rights of nature movement? My work probes these questions through ethnographic encounters with indigenous practitioners, legal scholars, plant scientists, ethnobotanists, and medicinal plants themselves across territories, ritual houses, and legal documents and Zoom meetings in southwestern regions of Putumayo and Nariño in the southwest region of Colombia. So this is just an overview of what is going on in Amazonia. Over the past last few years, the Colombian Amazon has been the center of a new extractivist regime, but also the recipient of large international conservation efforts. The expansion of the industrial oil and gold extraction, as well as the construction of dams, is concurrently happening with a race in the environmental regulations in post-conflict, post-accord Colombia. As you might know, Colombia just about a few years ago signed a peace agreement, and we are in the verge of implementing this agreement, finding a lot of opposition from the current government. So recently, the legislations and court decisions have started to protect environmental rights, while also declaring the legal standing of rivers and forests. The Colombian Constitutional Court, for example, recognized the legal rights of a mercury polluted river in the Pacific rainforest, and the Supreme Court did the same for the Amazon River. Moreover, the 2016 peace agreement between the Colombian government and one of the largest guerrilla groups included the preservation of the environment as an important goal of its rural agenda. Yet this document still pushes for the industrial development and extractivist activity described above. In fact, different cycles of resource extraction have already led to disastrous deforestation rates right after the peace agreement was signed, which triggered international conservation efforts to steadily increase in this region. In the Colombian Amazon alone, deforestation doubled last year, thus heavily impacting indigenous territories and modes of governance. So non-anthropocentric legal narratives and practices seem to be part of the solution to this problem, in my view. Existing models of environmental governance exist in parallel to extractivist practices in Amazonia, yet recent legislation that highlight the rights of nature do not address this ongoing paradox. To offer potential responses, my work studies how indigenous communities, scientists in Colombia, and legal scholars contribute to a paradigm shift for the protection of this region, from a piecemeal environmental law to a system-based ecological law. And here I'm joining efforts with many scholars, among them Kirsten Anker, Geoff Garver, and many others, who are thinking about this transition. Environmental law generally focuses on remediating the negative side effects of economic development, restricting pollution, and protecting natural resources primarily for human use. Meanwhile, ecological law integrates science and traditional knowledge systems to live within planetary boundaries. Ecological law also creates a legal framework needed so that humans recognize the inherent value of other natural beings and justly share the burdens of environmental stress. At the intersection between what we can call posthumanist anthropology, legal theory, and plant studies, I explored the limits and possibilities of an ecological turn in legal theory and practice in the Andean Amazonian region today, also framing this conversation within current decolonial conversations in the region. Specifically, I asked how forests become legal agents through indigenous scientific and legal practices, how human and other than human beings, such as Amazonian plants, co-produce protocols for forest governance, and finally, how a law that comes from a territory challenges concepts of justice, agency, and value in times of socio-ecological transitions in this region. So I'm basically interested in certain Amazonian plants as an entry point to discuss political and legal problems in context of neo-extractivism and its legal alternatives in this region. My premise, of course, is that there are many reactions to extractivism from the grassroots, but there is far less attention to how legal tools can provide also solutions, because law is usually thought of as a tool of the state. Connected to this, a commitment to learn how the law is taken up in Amazonia. And one important element of this exploration is learning how human communities produce what we might call normative claims as they engage with different beings in the forest, particularly medicinal plants that are central to these communities. The plants, however, are not only living beings that you can study through ethnobotany, etc. They are persons, teachers, masters, guides, and the like. And this language is important not only because it shows how some communities create worlds that are not amenable to modern divisions of knowledge and life, but also because these modern divisions are being redefined, for example, through the idiom of the rise of nature. Moreover, these norms are not only talking about nature as an object of property or an object of protection through environmental regulations, but also as a subject with rights. And here it's an important change that is not only a change in epistemology, that is a change in the tools that we use to talk about the world and draw meaning from the world. Actually, it is also about how this language evokes other practices to make things, to make realities, in a word, to make worlds. In a sense, it is also an issue of ontology, which is a big word that I'm happy to unpack if there is time. My project then is about the ontologies of the law. Practices with plants and other beings as persons and meaning-making selves seem crucial to understand this shift in law in the Andean Amazonian region today. So what are potential implications of this for legal institutions and what I'm thinking of this co-emergent relationship between non-humans and humans in these places? So resulting in a dissertation manuscript, my research has three main implications for an earth-oriented legal paradigm in Amazonia and potentially beyond Amazonia. These implications refer to, first, legal theory; second, to the limits and possibilities of the current movement of the rise of nature; third, legal teaching and learning; and finally, concrete scenarios of adjudication, for instance, in a court of law. So the legal theory, the first part of my work, I'm calling Law Otherwise, illustrates, inspired by the work of Arturo Escobar and many others, illustrates why the connection between more than humans and the law matters today in the face of interrelated socio-ecological crises that I just described above. So I study the material speech of plants and the potential implications of this notion for legal thinking in Amazonia, and I'm studying this from the vantage point of local communities as well as scientists, particularly ethnobotanists, and in particular one ethnobotanist. I will talk about this if there is time. So this is to further probe these connections between law and the more than human world, and I study the making also of an ethnobotanical research agreement between an ethnobiologist in Colombia, the political and spiritual authorities of the Kufan community, a legal scholar, myself, and others, plants, and what indigenous practitioners from this region refer to as the invisible ones. And this part tackles different issues, in particular how territorial decision-making takes place with the participation of different kinds of beings. This part of my work might impact decision-making theory, but also legal theory, where more than human beings are present either as subjects of property or environmental protections, rather than sources of legal meaning in their own right. And this brings us to the second larger potential impact of this work, which regards to the limits and possibilities of the rise of nature conversation. The first part offers ethnographic evidence to support the theoretical claims of the second part of my work, which is called Rights of Nature, Limits and Possibilities. The second part concerns precisely that the limits and possibilities of this approach in the double context of post-extractivist economies in Amazonia and emergent the Earth Law movement in the region and extending worldwide. By attending to the social and legal worlds of the modern human beings introduced in the first part, the second part reworks key concepts of Western law that are central to the rights of nature approach, namely the notion of rights, and I use the trope of conjuring beings and relations for that matter, the notion of personhood, and the notion of legal standing. While I suggest a conceptual shift from divisionist to relational legal language, this critique has a bearing in actual learning and adjudicating scenarios in Amazonia and probably beyond. This brings us to the third larger set of potential implications of my work. So legal learning and legal adjudication. So the third and final part of my work discusses how the first two parts can be used as tools for legal transformation in concrete scenarios of legal learning and adjudication. For example, I present a summary of the different agencies that I'm calling agency scaffolding introduced in the ethnographic portion of the dissertation, involved in legal decision-making in Amazonia, and also how specific indigenous legal traditions, the Inga among them, transform state law instead of the other way around. Usually the focus is how state law transform indigenous way of lives instead of how indigenous thinking and ways of thinking about the law and enacting the law in their territories might transform the way we think about law at the state level. And I hope that this is also contributing to this emergent Earth Law movement with different, very internally multiple trajectories and iterations. So in regards to the legal education, the goal is twofold. First is to decolonize legal education through indigenous legal traditions, and second, to contribute to the epistemic justice in the classroom and beyond. And I want to make a caveat here, very important. This decolonization is not just a change in the language, it's a change actually in the practices with concrete territories in concrete places. So I'm happy to talk about this meaning later on. So in terms of legal education, to contribute to the decolonization of law by learning indigenous legal traditions according to local protocols, and this is very important because it requires an attunement to what happens locally, and an ethical and humble approach to what happens locally. And also to contribute to cognitive justice by probing how indigenous legal traditions might contribute to recenter the law in your system, in Earth systems. So in terms of legal adjudication, the goal is also twofold. To judge, for instance, the judge should be able to compare between different legal traditions before adjudicating rights and responsibilities, instead of treating indigenous legal traditions as just a datum, a cultural belief of a particular community. It should be taken as in equal standing to some extent to adjudicate rights. And I use the notion of comparative legal cosmologies in order to do that. And I think judges and legislators need to be trained in this kind of thinking at some point. So 2 points here: comparing praxis of law across different legal traditions. Legislators and judges, as I said, need to hold space for indigenous legal traditions in their own rights. And second is to radicalize, meaning going to the roots of this idea, the rights of nature approach, instead of having nature become this kind of abstract, all-encompassing person who has received the rights from the state in a top-down kind of approach, and just to transition from that idea to an idea of thinking about those rights as they exist in live worlds of indigenous practices. And I think that shift is very important because he'll put us in the conversation of encountering these traditions in their own terms and using their protocols. So takeaways. I actually want to summarize my take by quoting indigenous Inga thinker and leader Hernando Chindoy, who has shared the story of the tapir at the beginning of this presentation. So he said, Inga law is recognized in daily life as the existence of the infinite interrelationships between humans and non-human beings in their material and spiritual dimensions. Inga law is also found in the Inga language as one of its most important sources, but also not only source, where our forms of governance are revitalized. The methodology to recognize and study the law in our community, he said, is to return to ancestral knowledge is actually very actual, from a decolonized perspective and through our own language and practices. And this requires a special connection with different beings of the forest as a way to transform legal paradigms that damage our territories. And I want to make a very important caveat at the end, which is trying to understand how weaving indigenous ways of thinking and doing with science, it's a tricky one. And the conversation needs to be very respectful. It has to be done in terms of symmetry, recognizing limits, recognizing when it's wise to politely detach from that conversation, and also recognizing that today science, particularly plant scientists that I'm working with in different places, for instance, Monica Gagliano in the Australian case, have proven how actually plants can make decisions and how close this idea is to indigenous traditions, but also how interesting that science in a way is catching up with this very important insight that it's important not only for local communities, but it's also important if we want to transition from a world where law is something of the state to a world where law is centered on these practices, which is unearthed law. So thank you so much for listening. And I want to finish by acknowledging the indigenous community of Inga, the COFAN community and interlocutors, my supervisors, Nicolás Cosoy, Eduardo Con, Kirsten Anker, Taita, Hernando Chindoy, the ethnobotanist David Rodriguez, the Conciencias Institution, and also the leadership for the Cosoy, particularly Dina, Peter, and Daisy, and my L3 colleagues as well at McGill. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the conversation.